Studies show that the recovering COVID-19 patients, from the asymptomatic to the very sick, are showing significant antibody response. Studies show that SARS and MERS, also coronaviruses, induce immunity for at least 2 to 3 years. And yet the media continues to report that we have no evidence that patients who survive coronavirus have immunity.
Welcome to Black Spring. Now today, I'd like to take a look at a Senate hearing which involves Dr. Fauci and Senator Rand Paul, taking a look at the case studies, the specifics on the case studies, the beginning trajectory along with the current trajectories, and what's changed, and also how are these results being communicated in the mainstream media. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn.
I think actually the truth is the opposite. We have no evidence that survivors of coronavirus don't have immunity, and a great deal of evidence to suggest that they do. The question of immunity is linked to health policy, and that workers who have gained immunity can be a strong part of our economic recovery. The silver lining to so many infections in the meat processing industry is that a large portion of these workers now have immunity. Those workers should be reassured that they likely won't get it again, instead of being alarmed by media reports that there is no evidence of immunity. You've stated publicly that you'd bet it all that survivors of coronavirus have some form of immunity. Can you help set the record straight that the scientific record, as it is being accumulated, is supportive that infection with coronavirus likely leads to some form of immunity? Dr. Fauci.
Yep, thank you for the question, Senator Paul. Yes, you're correct that I have said that given what we know about the recovery from viruses such as coronaviruses in general, or even any infectious disease with very few exceptions, that when you have antibody present, it very likely indicates a degree of protection. I think it's in the semantics of how this is expressed. When you say, has it been formally proven by long-term natural history studies, which is the only way that you could prove, one, is it protective, which I said and would repeat, is likely that it is, but also, what is the degree or titer of antibody that gives you that critical level of protection, and what is the durability? As I've often said, and I again repeat, you can make a reasonable assumption that it would be protective, but natural history studies over a period of months to years would then tell you definitively if that's the case.
And I think that's important because, in all likelihood, is a good way of putting it, the vast majority of these people will have immunity. Instead of saying there is no evidence, the WHO kind of fed into this by saying no evidence of immunity. And in reality, there's every evidence stacking up. And in fact, a lot of the different studies have shown that it is very unlikely that you get it again in the short term. With regard to going back to school, one thing that was left out of that discussion is mortality. I mean, shouldn't we at least be discussing what the mortality of children is? This is for Dr. Fauci as well. The mortality between 0 and 18 in the New York data approaches 0. It's not going to be absolutely 0, but it almost approaches 0. Between 18 and 45, the mortality in New York was 10 out of 100,000. So really, we do need to be thinking about that. We need to observe with an open mind what went on in Sweden, where the kids kept going to school. The mortality per capita in Sweden is actually less than France, less than Italy, less than Spain, less than Belgium, less than the Netherlands, about the same as Switzerland. But basically, I don't think there's anybody arguing that what happened in Sweden is an unacceptable result. I think people are intrigued by it, and we should be. I don't think any of us are certain when we do all these modelings. There have been more people wrong with modeling than right. We're opening up a lot of economies around the U.S., and I hope that people who are predicting doom and gloom and saying, oh, we can't do this, there's going to be a surge, will admit that they were wrong if there isn't a surge, because I think that's what's going to happen. In rural states, we never really reached any sort of pandemic levels in Kentucky and other states. We have less deaths in Kentucky than we have in an average flu season. It's not to say this isn't deadly, but really outside of New England, we've had a relatively benign course for this virus nationwide. And I think the one size fits all, that we're going to have a national strategy and nobody's going to go to school, is kind of ridiculous. We really ought to be doing it school district by school district, and the power needs to be dispersed because people make wrong predictions. And really the history of this, when we look back, will be of wrong prediction after wrong prediction after wrong prediction, starting with Ferguson in England. So I think we ought to have a little bit of humility in our belief that we know what's best for the economy. And as much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you're the end all. I don't think you're the one person that gets to make a decision. We can listen to your advice, but there are people on the other side saying there's not going to be a surge and that we can safely open the economy, and the facts will bear this out. But if we keep kids out of school for another year, what's going to happen is the poor and underprivileged kids who don't have a parent that's able to teach them at home are not going to learn for a full year. And I think we ought to look at the Swedish model, and we ought to look at letting our kids get back to school. I think it's a huge mistake if we don't open the schools in the fall. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to that even though there are only 32 seconds left?
Yes, and you might make it clear whether or not you suggested that we shouldn't go back to school in the fall.
Well, first of all, Senator Paul, thank you for your comments. I have never made myself out to be the end-all and only voice in this. I'm a scientist, a physician, and a public health official. I give advice according to the best scientific evidence. There are a number of other people who come into that and give advice that are more related to the things that you spoke about the need to get the country back open again and economically. I don't give advice about economic things. I don't give advice about anything other than public health. So I wanted to respond to that. The second thing is that you use the word we should be humble about what we don't know. And I think that falls under the fact that we don't know everything about this virus. And we really better be very careful, particularly when it comes to children, because the more and more we learn, we're seeing things about what this virus can do that we didn't see from the studies in China or in Europe. For example, right now, children presenting with COVID-19 who actually have a very strange inflammatory syndrome, very similar to Kawasaki's syndrome. I think we better be careful if we are not cavalier in thinking that children are completely immune to the deleterious effects. So again, you're right in the numbers that children in general do much, much better than adults and the elderly, and particularly those with underlying conditions. But I am very careful and hopefully humble in knowing that I don't know everything about this disease, and that's why I'm very reserved in making broad predictions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Now, for one, here's a bit of a sticky spot. As a nation, this vulnerability in our health governance seems to be a bit of a gray area. And for example, you might think, why is it important to recognize some of the examples here, or some of the governance involved here? Well, for one, if we look at it, if you think in terms of government elected versus an appointed official. Now, in the United States, we the people actually elect our leaders, whether it's the House of Representatives or whether it's our senators. We also have agencies here in the U.S. Of course, we have the American Medical Association, we have the CDC. In this case, the CDC actually appointed Dr. Fauci. Now, he was not elected by we, the American people, as a health official or a authority. He was not elected by we, the people, to manage this actual pandemic or the course or the trajectory in which it would be managed or handled. However, Dr. Fauci's position is also, it's a bit of a sticky spot, because it also resembles more of a European model in which a centralized committee actually appoints a public health official. Now, we see that also with the UN. The UN also appointed, the UN also parents the WHO organization, which is, they also appointed Tedros Adhanom. Now, he was appointed by the UN. He wasn't elected by the European citizens. He was elected by a committee. Now, these are not, that may be the European or more of a globalist way of handling elections or appointing figures, but that's not an American or a Democrat process. When I say Democrat, I'm speaking of the process. The democratic process was not something that the American people have undergone in order to elect an actual scientist, doctor, or even an actual healthcare or public health official. We have not engaged in a democrat process to elect that type of figure. So also the concern here in terms of the sticky part here is the issue with sovereignty and the issue of American liberties. This is also a point in which I brought up on, of course, when it comes to the USMCA, the particular document in which the USMCA, those agreements, those negotiations will be made by an appointed committee, the trade agreements, who's allowed to enter the country, the number of immigrants or immigrants that will be allowed to enter the country. There are social protections in that document that will permit a committee, an appointed group of officials will be making those decisions for who comes into the United States, which is very much a risk for American sovereignty and, of course, American liberty. So that takes the power, that's a transfer of power of the American people, from the American people into a remote, centralized government in which the people have no control and no voice in who the committee appoints to make those decisions on trade. So this is the sticky element of our healthcare, the vulnerability of our healthcare system, in which we have someone that's an appointee rather than an elected official of our healthcare. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring. Let me know what your concerns are. Let me know what you think in terms of the trajectory. I mean, the trajectory, where we are in terms of the pandemic, the response. What do you think? Do you think Dr. Fauci his concerns are warranted? Do you think that we should consider other models for more results? Or do you think that Senator Rand Paul, who happens to be a doctor himself, do you think he has a point when it comes to our overall considering more information and the overall effects of children not being able to return to school based on the amount of inconsistencies and contradictories that have been evident so far? I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. Please like, share, subscribe, or even unlike, and let me know what your comments and concerns are. Thank you for joining me on this segment of Black Spring with Autumn.